Hello and welcome to Kerbal Space Program. My name is Peter and thank you for joining me. So, today I wanted to do more of a talking video. The reason for this video is I want to go through some of what I would call the basics of rocket building and design. And basically the principles that I use when building a rocket. So it's not quite a 101, but it is just some points that I wanted to cover. So the reason I wanted to do this video is basically I was doing one of my episodes on one of my other Kerbal videos, and basically I figured that I could go into a lot more depth about rocketry, or some of the figures and some of the numbers that are used when building a rocket. Okay, so without further ado, so basically the key components of a rocket is either a satellite or, in this case, a command pod. And this is very basic. Okay, and then you have your fuel tanks, and then you have an engine. Okay, so that is a very basic rocket. Okay, now there are some key points to rocket design requirement. Okay, so you want to set out what you want to achieve with the rocket. Okay, so do you want to put a man into orbit? So if you want to put a man into orbit, you need to know one thing: how much delta V it's going to take to get this capsule into orbit, for instance. Okay, with this as an example. So this capsule on its own weighs 840 kilos, just short of 1 ton or 1 metric ton. Okay, now one consideration you're going to need is, okay, so you want to get that capsule into space, you're going to do that. Okay, so how much speed do you need? Okay, or delta V specifically. So delta V is now I believe the technical term for this is the change in speed that the rocket can produce. Okay, now that's going to be a number that is, it's a variable in the sense that it can change dependent on the situation. So at ground level, this particular rocket has a delta V of 2,622 meters per second. Now that's the amount of change in speed that this rocket can affect at this very point. Okay, if it was in space in a zero without an atmosphere, it would produce 3,251. Now with that, the limiting factor there's multiple factors. Okay, so 1, the weight of the rocket. 2, the atmospheric drag on the rocket. Okay, so that's going to be part of the reason why there's a big difference. 2, the ISP, or the specific impulse of the engine that you are using. Now some engines are optimized for early in a flight, so ground level within the atmosphere. So they will produce a much closer ISP in space or to space to what they do on ground level. So for instance, this engine, if we look at that one, it's the LVT15 Valiant liquid fuel engine. Now this, at ground level or in atmospheric at sea level, okay, it produces an ISP of 250. Now that gives it a thrust at sea level of 84.677 kilonewtons. Okay, at in vacuum of space, for instance, it produces 105. So there's quite a small difference, only 60 difference. Now let's look, for instance, at the LV909 Terrier. So this engine produces 85, or has an ISP of 85 at sea level, so not a lot. But in vacuum, it's 345, which is very efficient. So the higher the number in the ISP, the better. So think that like miles per gallon, okay, in a car. Now, if you take that and look at the thrust numbers as a result, so thrust at sea level is only 14.783 kilonewtons. That's not going to be enough to do a lot. And at vacuum, it's 60. Now, 60 may not sound a lot, but when you're already in vacuum and you've shed most of your weight through fuel, maybe staging if you've got a multi-stage rocket, you're not going to have a lot of weight left to push. And you're already in vacuum, so there's no atmospheric drag, or very little at least. Okay, so that's why that engine's a lot smaller and a lot less powerful, but at the same time, it's more optimized for vacuum. So that is the Delta V and the ISP, or specific impulse, covered. Okay, so just to recap, Delta V is the change in velocity that this rocket can affect, and the ISP is basically your miles per gallon. The higher the number, the less fuel it uses to produce the same amount, or the more thrust it produces at the same amount of fuel. Okay, so moving on. TWR, okay, thrust to weight ratio. So if we bring Kerbal Engineer Redux in, this is a mod, okay, it's all about the numbers. So it gives you all the numbers you need. So at the current, we have three basic parts: the command pod, the fuel tank, and the engine. Okay, it costs 1,900 in Kerbal Space Program, and it weighs just over 6 metric tons. Its ISP at in vacuum is 310, as we know here. And it's got 105 kilonewtons of thrust. Again, this is at vacuum, and its thrust to weight ratio is 1.76. Now, the thrust to weight ratio is basically the ratio between the weight of the rocket and the thrust output of the engine. Now, in order to get a rocket to lift off the ground, you need it to be higher than 1. Okay, so 1 is basically where the thrust and the weight is equalized. So it's not going to lift off, but it's also not below that level. I know that's not a very great explanation, but basically it's balanced. Okay. Now I can give you a quick demonstration of this. Okay, so I am going to make this engine. So at the minute it's got a thrust to weight of 1.76. So if we launch this, okay, and we can then see what that does. Again, very basic rocket. No, we've not thought about orbital maneuvering. We've not thought about getting into orbit yet. We've not even thought about getting the person safely back. We've not thought about, obviously, re-entry heating, parachutes, or decoupling so that only the capsule returns safely. So, again, very basic. So currently we have a thrust to weight of 1.76. But we will look at this because this number here is going to tell us what that actually is. Because that thrust to weight ratio is based at vacuum. So this number here, I believe, is the surface level thrust to weight ratio. Okay, and it's 1.42, which is fine. Okay, personally I normally aim for 1.3 to 1.5 as my thrust to weight ratio at takeoff or lift-off. So we're just going to set this going. Okay, so if you can see, it takes off nice and smoothly. It's not going really slowly so that it's starting to wobble because it's slow, obviously being slow. It's just taking off nicely. Okay, and as it gets closer to the as the atmosphere gets thinner, this number raises. Also, as it uses fuel, the rocket becomes lighter, so the thrust to weight ratio actually increases as well with that. So you've got a twofold increase, one on the obviously reduction of drag and a reduction of weight. So that is increasing your thrust to weight ratio twofold. Okay, or on two fronts even. Okay, and obviously as we're using fuel, you can see that our delta V is also reducing because obviously we've used some of that delta V. So as we use it, it decreases, the same as a fuel tank level. Okay, so it can be seen in a very similar light, but it is a dynamic number that is made up of many variables. So I'm just launching this, seeing how high we can get it. Okay, so again we can get this pretty high. So I'm letting this run out because I want to use this as a demonstration later in the video. So this rocket running at full thrust for the duration of its tank, duration of its available burn. We are about to run out of fuel, and I want to see what height we can get our apoapsis to. We have left the atmosphere already. So if I grab a piece of paper, our maximum height on that rocket, okay, is 476,456. 476,456. Okay, so there we go. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to revert this back to vehicle assembly. Okay, and I'm going to then reduce the thrust. So I'm going to actually put it below 1. Okay, so our thrust to weight ratio is at 0.9, and then I'm going to show you what that does, or what happens. And then launching in 3, 2, 1. Again, our service level is actually lower, so it's 0.73. So as you can see, the engine's running at full blast. It's producing as much thrust as it can at this point. Obviously, limited to 51% to demonstrate the point. Okay, so I'm just going to let this sit. Okay, and we're just going to let it run out. Oh, can't do it that way. Forgot about that. So 0.8. So our surface level thrust to weight is increasing at 0.81. So once it hits 1, you will see what actually happens. .89, 0.94. So we're a bit closer now, so I'm going to let this do its own thing. So we're only 0.03 away. 0.98, 0.99, 1. So this is where we start to get liftoff as this increases to over 1. So as you can see, we have started to lift off. Now if we was to able to get this back down to 1, effectively we would be hovering. So that is what happens, okay? So now what I want to do is I need to know how much delta V it takes to orbit kerbing. Okay, again that's based on many numbers. Okay, it's obviously based on weight, thrust, specific impulse, okay, and obviously weight, thrust, aerodynamic drag, and specific impulse, okay. I'm sure there are other variables in that as well, but they are the basic things that I know of, okay, or that I definitely know affect this. Okay, so to get more delta V you need more fuel. I'll put this back up. So from what I've just read, to get into an 80 kilometer orbit it takes about 4,500 delta V, okay. So in order to do that, so in order to get to a higher altitude, so I'm going to put more fuel tanks on, okay. So almost there already, look, okay. So let's put one more on. There we go. So we're now at 4,587. The problem you're going to get now is diminishment returns. Okay, so let's maybe double the size of that, because these are double the size of that one. Let's put another one of these on, okay. So you've only increased that by, so one of these was 2,500. This went up to 4,200, but then this one only actually added 500 meters per second. Now the reason for that is that our delta V has dropped below 0.71. So what I'm going to do is actually take one of these out. Okay, so now it's 1.1. So what we can do now is actually put 1.01 is not enough to do what we want to do. So what we can now do is actually give ourselves a bigger engine. So with that engine, this creates 4,281. Okay, so that's not enough to get there. So I'm going to add this engine, which is more powerful, okay, but it is a higher delta V at higher specific impulse at sea level. Okay, so now we have a TWR of 2.21, but the problem with that is we don't have enough delta V because we need 4,500. We only had 3,000 slot. So there we go. That is one way to do it, but we may have a better way. Okay, so this is a single stage to almost orbit by being short of by about 40 odd meters per second. But what we can actually do now is use this engine because it is more, but it is equally efficient at higher altitudes, and then we can actually have this as a second stage. Okay, so this will now become a two-stage rocket. Okay, but look at that, our delta V has dropped again, which is really unusual because we haven't actually set our staging. So now we need to get our stages in order. So first thing we want to happen is this engine to burn. Boom. So now look at this, okay. So we have 2,000 meters per second. Okay, I'm actually going to use a different display here for this one, just delta V stats. Okay, so let me just do this again. Okay, so we have 3,885 meters per second. This has nearly as much with half as many tanks and a smaller engine, so it's only 600 short. But here's the trick. So we now add this engine and these two tanks. So our TWR at sea level, okay, is 1.28, which is fine. It's going to get it off the ground. Okay, that stage alone has 2,037. Okay, and then the second stage has 3,251, giving us a vacuum say in vacuum delta V of 5,289. Now you just remember, see, this single engine on its own, without this engine, without the second stage, so we're just going to put the fuel tank bits up here, that is in this one, on here, and so all of that fuel in one single stage, 4,464. So we got over 600 increase just by creating it as a second stage. So actually having a lot of the fuel tanks and the heavy engine decouple and fall away. So we're shedding weight, okay, and we are therefore much more able to get up to the altitude we want. Now this is again based on some variables. So 4,364 is what our delta V would be if we just stayed in the atmosphere. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, so I'm going to actually launch this. Okay, I'm going to use MechJeb to do it because it is the most efficient way to get a stable orbit. So we're going to use ascent guidance. Now if any of you saw my previous video on Kerbal Space Program, I would have obviously gone through some of the features. So I want this orbit to be an 80 kilometer orbit, just 10 kilometers above the Kerbal equivalent of a Kármán line. Okay, so I'm going to show this, and I'm going to engage it. So now I need to manually stage or light the engines as such. So I'm just going to hit the spacebar to do that and go. There we go. So we've lifted off. So as you can see, our service TWR was about 1.4. Okay, so this burn will last, or this stage will last another minute and 10 seconds. So that is here. We have this much delta V remaining. Okay, and as you can see, our surface level is increasing. So we are starting to bank now for our orbit. Okay. So let's just see what happens. I think I need a new chair. This is so creaky. So we're coming up, we're just 15 seconds away from our staging. Okay, I may actually redo this because of lack of light. So as you can see, we're almost at the edge of space already. And we have staged, so we've ditched a load of weight. And we still have another 3,100 meters per second left. We're already exiting the atmosphere. Now this kind of staging is pretty much used by every single national space agency, okay? So SpaceX uses it, obviously NASA uses it, Roscosmos uses it. I would imagine that both, I know Ariane Space, which is ESA, uses it. JAXA with their Mitsubishi H2As, is it? Use it. Obviously United Launch Alliance and with their Delta and Atlas rockets, Electron will use it. You've also got what is now Grumman Aerospace Technologies, which was, what was their name now? I can't remember the name. So obviously you had the Antares Cygnus rockets. Okay. They all used staged, multi-stage rockets. Okay. Apollo was a multi-stage rocket, or even the Saturn V, to be correct. The most famous rockets are all multi-stage. In some way, even the space shuttle, effectively, I wouldn't call it a single stage to orbit because it shed weight as it ascended. So it got rid of its solid rocket boosters once they had finished. It got rid of its external fuel tank once it had emptied. So we are now in orbit. We still have 1,527 as our delta V. Now, I'm just going to engage this, and I am going to now do a retrograde burn. Now, other terminologies. You have prograde, which is pointing in the direction you are flying. Okay, so I'm going to use a maneuver node here just to demonstrate. Sorry, wrong one. So, add a maneuver. So this is prograde, okay? In Kerbal, this is the symbol for prograde. Okay, this is retrograde. Now, what retrograde is, it points in the opposite direction. So it's pointing at where you've just come from and not where you are going. So it's like looking out, pointing at the back of the car. So if the car's going forward, that's prograde if you're looking out the front. So the normal way to be sat in a car. If you're sat in the boot facing the back windscreen, that would be retrograde. So almost like reversing. Then you have normal and anti-normal. Now, not entirely sure how these are defined, but one is 90 degrees perpendicular, so at a right angle to the course that you are currently on. Okay, so call this the course, for instance. This would be normal, and anti-normal is the opposite direction. Not really sure how you define which is which, but that is what they are. So what they will do, if you burn that way, as you can see, it is turning our orbit in the opposite direction. So it is it's like cornering. Okay. Then you have radial in, radial out. So if you're orbiting a planet, say Kerbal, radial in is pointing in towards that planet, so inside your orbit, basically inside your orbit. Radial out is outside. Okay, so radial in will do that. Okay, so it pulls the orbit path inwards. Radial out, we'll pull it outwards, so it will redirect you outwards, and as you can see, the effect that has. Okay, obviously if you have a target set, you can point towards the target, and obviously anti-target is pointing away. And then if you have created a maneuver node, you have maneuver on here as well, so that will point you in the right direction for your maneuver that you have set. Okay, so that is the basics of maneuvering. So in order to come out of orbit, you need to slow yourself down, because what you don't want to be pointing radial in, because you're not really losing much speed. You're actually going to come in very fast. The best and most efficient way to come into orbit and actually land or re-enter the atmosphere would be to slow down. So we're going to go retrograde, and we're going to actually burn, or not. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. So I was hitting caps lock. So as you can see, there we go. So we have actually slowed down really quickly, and as you can see, we will re-enter the atmosphere. Now we will get some atmospheric drag, and you will see also re-entry heating. So let's see what happens. So I'm actually going to disengage our stability control now. Okay, and just let it fall in. So as you can see, the air is starting to have an effect on this rocket. It is starting to spin around. And we are increasing speed, so our speed is currently 2,288 meters per second and climbing. Now we are getting some atmospheric reheating, but you can see reheating, and this will be like plasma. Okay, so this will be very, very hot, very excited. Atoms and particles. Okay, so as you can see, it's getting rather warm, still doing over 2,000 meters per second, and stuff is starting to get rather warm, and our engine has just blown up from overheating, our capsule, and everyone's died. So we need to rectify this. So how do we do that? So we basically need to separate the capsule, because we cannot protect this whole section from heat. Okay, so what we do is we have a heat shield, and what happens is basically this heat shield is designed where it protects the capsule by creating a shield. But you can't just create a shield out of, say, metal, because one, metal will get hot, it will melt, so it won't actually protect. So it has what's called as a for instance, an ablative material is what is generally used. I believe there are now some other materials, but most of the time they are ablative, and there are methods of doing this. I believe SpaceX with their BFR or Starship is going to use an actively cooled heat shield, so it won't ablate to the same extent, or which I will now explain. So ablative heat shields basically are a material that is heat resistant or but what happens is it burns away. It sort of almost it doesn't burn away, but it is almost worn away by the heat and the wind force. And what it does is it does that. The hot bits that burn effectively are taken away, also take the heat away with it. Okay, so it is able to much better manage the heat. Now, some are used. Some are made from, I believe, reinforced carbon. I believe that might. Don't hold me to this. I might be wrong, but I believe that was the ablative or the type of ablative material that was used on the Apollo command module. You also have silica. Now, silica is what was used as, among other materials, on the space shuttle. I believe they may have used some reinforced carbon as well. Now, silica is really great at containing heat and not letting it out. So I remember watching a video, I believe it was actually Richard Hammond on engineering connections. It is on YouTube somewhere. Look that up if you are interested in this sort of thing. But they used this material on the heat shield tiles all over the bottom of a space shuttle. Okay, and I actually heated one of these up in a furnace. Similar sort of thing to what you would use to melt metal, okay, and glass and that sort of furnace, okay. And they took it out, and they held it by the corners. This cube of silica. They held it by the corners with their hands, and it was still glowing hot, and that just demonstrated how good it was at containing and managing heat for obviously atmospheric re-entry. So we've now got this ablative material. So the faster, hotter that you come in, the faster this wears down. So you need to be careful that you don't come in too hot, because you will wear this ablator down, and once it's worn down, it will not protect you anymore. Okay, so we are now going to create a decoupler. Okay, so there we go. So there's our rocket. Okay, that looks ridiculous, so what I'm going to do is that. So let's try this again. Okay. So again, I'm going to use the same method. I'm not going to change anything. The only thing I've done is add a disc decoupler to rid us of this stage that we will not need when re-entering, so that we can then have our ablative heat shield obviously in the hot air flow. So we're going to launch exactly the same orbit, exactly the same method. Okay, and see what happens. So we're now ascending. Okay. So pretty soon we should start to bank over now. So we are now banking over. We're now coming up slowly on 500 meters per second. Okay, so I'm still letting it do exactly the same as what I did before. Okay, we are coming up on our staging now in 10 seconds. So this first stage, which is this bit here, will jettison. Okay, and then our second engine and our second stage will fire. There we go. So this is all being done by MechJeb. I'm not telling it to do this, it's just doing it for me. So the first stage doesn't even make it to space. Some rockets it will, I believe. Maybe, don't hold me to that. But they could be made to, I reckon. And as simple as that, we have got our orbital height. So now it's going to coast out to the edge of space before adjusting its attitude. I believe it's attitude, yeah. Yeah, to point towards the manoeuvre. So there we go, it's now in the right direction, pointing for manoeuvre. MechJeb is now going to auto warp the time to where we need to burn, and it's going to do that now. So it's now circularizing the orbit. So what is that doing? So this is what we're at the minute. So it's now doing a second burn to bring it out to this dotted line, which means that we will be in orbit. So here you can clearly see vessel mass going down and the amount of acceleration as a result going up, because our thrust to weight ratio is increasing. But our delta V is also coming down because we are burning fuel. And there we go, we are in orbit. So now what we're going to do, good, yeah, there we go, perfect, to the meters per second. I'm now going to point retrograde. I'm going to leave it in this view for now as I do that, so that you can see what happens. So now, as you can see, this is our periapsis. So our periapsis is the lowest point in the orbit. The apoapsis is the highest. Okay, so if you increase your periapsis enough, it's going to swap with your apoapsis, okay, and become the apoapsis. If you reduce your apoapsis enough, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to swap with the periapsis and become the periapsis. Okay, so whatever one is lower is always the periapsis, whatever one is higher is always the apoapsis. So I'm just going to slow us down a bit more now. As you can see, we're now going to fall out of orbit. Again, once you get below 70 kilometers, you're going to start getting atmospheric drag, which will slow you down naturally by air, or the air will. Okay, you may exit the atmosphere again, depending on obviously how much you slow down and the altitude you reach. So, but your apoapsis will not be quite as high, and eventually, if you do that enough times, you will still land. So, as you can see, I've now ditched our second stage, and we have our crew capsule on its own with its heat shield pointing directly in. So the heat shield is pointing prograde towards obviously the direction that you are going. So I'm now going to accelerate this time. Okay. And we can see what happens. So our speed is increasing again like it did last time. Okay. So this design of capsule, this conical shape with a slightly curved base, is called it's a safe self-stabilizing shape. So what happens is when you do have this shape, it stabilizes itself and will always want to point this end first. Okay, so if you look, ready, there, and see it's trying to bring itself round, but it's not quite doing it. So it's heating up because obviously I've not got my heat shield pointing in the right direction. But as you can see, it's now brought itself round with no help from me. And what happens is the airflow coming, say for instance, coming down this side, as it hits this edge, as it points outwards, so as that comes out, there we go. Can't actually see that now. It actually hits that edge and pushes it back in. The same with this one, look, as it's hitting that edge, it's hitting the airflow, and the airflow is pushing it back in. So it is self-stabilizing. What you may actually get is leading edge vortices. So you could potentially, depending on how severe this shape is, you could get air vortices that build up in this pocket here, which would also have a very similar effect. So it would maybe push against the edge. Again, I'm not an aerodynamicist. I don't pretend to be, but that is my understanding of it. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. So we are now coming in, slowing down, look, okay, so we are already lower speed than what we were when everything overheated. As you can see, our ablator is wearing down, so it's dropped to 178, but we've still got that much left. Okay, so we've actually only lost about 12.5%, is it 12.5%? For 170, it's 25, it's something like that. I'm just thinking 100 is 50%, 50 would be 25, so if we've lost 25, it's 12.5. So roughly 12.5% loss in ablative material. Okay. So we made it through the atmospheric reheating, and we've slowed down enough so that we're not actually causing any heat anymore. So now I'm just going to let this come down. So this is now the next part in surviving orbital re-entry. Okay. The next stage, so what comes after this is actually going down to the ground. Okay. But in this case, we died. Now why was that? So the reason that was is because we still had 230 meters per second speed. So we hit the ground at that speed. Now obviously it's going to destroy you. 230.7 meters per second, okay? That is quite fast. It is actually 516.06 miles per hour. Okay, so that is basically hitting the ground at the cruising speed of a jet airliner. Okay, jet airliner flies at 550 generally, around that. Okay, so how do we slow ourselves down? Parachutes, yeah. So we actually are going to use this, not that parachute, that's the wrong one, this parachute, okay? So let's so I'm not going to get us into orbit this time. I need to demonstrate my point. Okay. So I'm gonna get us up. I'm gonna just point us straight up this time. Don't need to be in orbit. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna point us straight up, get us quite high, and then I'm going to try and accelerate down and get a similar sort of speed as orbital. Okay. So just going to point this up, keeping it pointing north towards the sky as such. So the effect this will have will be twofold. It will be both aerodynamic, as you can see it's more pointy now, so it should reduce atmospheric drag, and two, it should keep us alive when flying towards the ground, or falling towards the ground even. Okay, so as you can see, we are heading quite north. We are heading straight up. So what this is also demonstrating is that pointing straight up might not necessarily be the most efficient when wanting to orbit, because it's then going to take you more energy to go sideways. There we go. So that's the first stage gone, and our apoapsis is only actually 65,000 meters. Okay, so I'm going to get this up quite high, okay, so that I've got plenty of room to accelerate towards the ground when we are coming back down. Again, I want this to be about 2,000 meters per second, maybe 2.5, something like that, by the time we hit the ground, by the time we start atmospheric re-entry. So near 150 and then hold it there. There we go. There. So we are re-entering the atmosphere, or we will do. Actually, I'm going to restart this flight. Okay, so I'm going to revert this flight to launch. Now the reason for that is I want to put it to daytime so we can actually see what's happening. So nearly went back to night time, that went that fast. So there we go, let's launch. We can see what's going on. So I'm just going to let this accelerate now. Okay, so we are now approaching 30,000 meters apoapsis. Oh, there we go. I didn't actually stabilise. Okay, so we are going to have a bit of angle going on, which is fine. There we go. So, there we go, staged at 62,000 meters apoapsis. Again, I'm going to use this stage to get us up to 150,000 meters. So coming up to 120. Okay, so 130, 40, starting to slow my burn now. There. So that's fine. I'm not after a specific number here. Okay, so we're going to accelerate up now, so that we're at the point where we start to come down. So there we go. So I'm going to point prograde now. So our prograde on this path, because we've gone past our apoapsis, is now pointing downwards. Okay, so I'm actually going to point it downwards. So what I'm trying to do here now is I'm trying to affect the angle as well. So as you can see, I want to try and get this so if we actually land back on ground so that I can show you the difference. Okay. So we are currently at 1,000. So I'm going to get to 2,000, okay, and I'm going to stop my burn. There we go. And now I want to point retrograde. Okay. And I'm going to detach the second stage because we no longer need it again. So now coming down, starting our burn to burn up. I'm going to keep an eye on this because it's a very steep angle of attack. Okay, you're going to let it self-stabilise by disengaging this. So as you can see, we're slowing down very quickly. Lots of G-force, over 15 Gs there. That is a lot. So there we go. So now waiting for this icon to turn grey, which is done, and I'm releasing my parachute. The size of the parachute compared to the capsule is ginormous. But what it's going to do is going to bring our speed down. So we're already below the speed at which we hit the ground earlier on. Okay, 200. There we go. Slowing us right down now. Parachute's opened up, and we are now at 6 meters per second. Okay, and I'm just going to time accelerate here so we get nearer to the ground. Okay, and we are about to land. Love a lot of graphical tearing there on the shadow, and there we go. No damage. Okay, our ablator was only used by 194, so we still got 194 ablative material. We only used 6, but that's not the point here. The point is that the parachute slowed us down enough where we could land without dying. And that is the main point. You want the capsule, and more importantly the people inside it, to survive. Especially if you're like SpaceX, someone like that who wants to reuse this. You don't want it to be destroyed every time. You don't want it to be damaged or disformed in any way, so you don't want any distortion in, say, the the frame or anything like that. You want it to stay the same as it was. At very most, what you really only want to be replacing is maybe a few thrusters, the coupling for the staging or decoupler, and maybe a ablative material. Okay, the less you have to do to this after each launch, the better. So that is why we do that. Okay, well, not we, but that is why space rocket companies and spacecraft companies do things the way they do. And that is it. Okay, so we have gone through delta V, ISP or specific impulse, thrust to weight ratio, getting into orbit. Okay, so orbit, I didn't explain this earlier, but basically orbit is you're perpetually falling sideways. So the best way to get into orbit is to accelerate sideways, okay, because as you're going along, the gravity is pulling you down. So instead of going up and then falling back down like that, you accelerate up. You reach your orbital height, and gravity pulls you around. Okay, if you've got enough speed, you're going to accelerate fast enough. So if you've got the planet here, if you don't accelerate fast enough, you're just going to go. You're going to come down. You're going to come down short and hit what you're trying to orbit. If you get enough speed, you're going to fall like so. Okay, and then come back round and do it again. So like so. Okay. We've gone through orbit, we've gone through delta V, specific impulse, thrust to weight ratios, thrust amount, so obviously you've got more thrust, better, more horsepower effectively, staging, multi-stage rockets, decoupling, shedding weight, different engines for different types of situations, so sea level compared to vacuum, and all that. We've gone through atmospheric re-entry heating and how to avoid blowing up in it or burning up in it. Again, burning up can be useful. So Soyuz disposes of some of its parts by allowing them to burn up in the atmosphere on re-entry. So the only thing that's designed to survive is the bit with the people in. Progress crew cargo modules are designed so that they put the space station, they put rubbish and waste into it, and the rubbish and waste and the vessel itself burns up when it leaves and re-enters the atmosphere. So sometimes you want that to happen. Old satellites that are no longer used, ideally you take them out of orbit and you burn them up, because you do not want them staying in orbit and cluttering up space. We then went on to the next stage of re-entry, which is landing and using parachutes to slow ourselves down enough to land. Okay, and I believe we've covered the basics of rocketry in Kerbal Space Program. My advice when doing this is to have Kerbal Engineer Redux or MechJeb as well. They're two mods that I think are really handy to have, especially when you're first trying to work out how to play the game. Obviously working out how to design a good rocket to get into orbit or to get wherever you want to go. Okay. The only thing that I haven't covered is, I believe, orbital manoeuvring. So obviously we've gone into how you direct and all of that, but we haven't gone over the use of attitude control systems, so reaction wheels, for instance, or RCS thrusters, which are both very common used ways to manoeuvre. So but yeah, I mean, I may cover that in a later episode. Obviously, for what I wanted to cover today, this is exactly what I was looking to do. Okay, so that wraps up this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please hit that like button. If you didn't, you've got this one as well. Okay, please subscribe to any videos for notifications, please subscribe to the channel. If you did like this video, there will be more like this. Again, probably going to have that live, not probably, we are going to have that live stream on Sunday. I believe it will be about 2 p.m. Okay, I'm going to be doing another episode of Airport CEO, hopefully later tonight. I say later tonight, it's now 25 to 11, and I've still got to upload this. So I've got episode 14 of Airport CEO Norwich Build coming up, either today or tomorrow. Very busy day tomorrow for me though, so hopefully I can get some done. I'm also starting to do some starting to do some branding for both my channel. Okay, so I'm going to be working with this logo maybe. It may change. I'm also going to be renaming this channel to something else. Because obviously it's well known, if you've watched my videos before, it may well be known where, at least roughly where I live, and I really think that it might not be the greatest idea to have my name out there as well, especially after watching some other videos on YouTube over the last week. So I'm going to be rebranding this page at some point. But may or may not come with a completely new logo, but it will come at least with improved logo. I may well create a Twitter page. I'm not a Twitter user myself, but I think it's going to be very helpful when letting people know that obviously I've got videos coming out, videos have been released, obviously announcing live streams, and just keeping people informed of see what's going on with the channel. Okay, it's also going to allow me to interact with other YouTubers and content creators. So yeah, that's obviously going to come up. Looking over the next month or so, more news about the channel will be coming. I've got some rather good plans. Obviously I've already started upgrading my setup, so obviously started with a microphone the other day, Wednesday even. I'm going to be looking at improving my setup further over the coming weeks, as well as improving the quality and of my videos. Okay, so we'll be looking at adding animation in certain parts. Obviously I'm learning as we go. I've never done anything like this before, so I've never done video editing, never done streaming, and I've never recorded videos in this way. Okay, so it isn't all new to me. So lots going on over the coming weeks and months. Hope you enjoy following me on this journey. Again, if you want to do that, you can subscribe. Any comments, any feedback, anything you think could be better, any ideas even, so anything you may think you really want to see happen would be great. Okay, so again, got the Airport CEO video coming up later on tonight. We've got other games going to be played as well soon. I think I'm going to get to a certain point with Airport CEO and say, right, okay, that's enough for that series. I'm going to try and go to some other games and some different games. So a lot of the games that I've done so far, or the only games that I've done so far, have been simulations. So Kerbal Space Program being a type of space and air simulator. Obviously Airport CEO being airport simulating and sandbox and that sort of game. I want to get into something that's a little bit different, and just show the that I don't just do this sort of thing. Okay, so yeah, got that coming up as well. So yeah, I think we'll call that a day. So thank you very much again for watching. Goodbye.